Tera Raids! We all know what they are at this point. You fight a Pokemon with a hat and a group of 4 people and then try to catch it once you win, or get blasted out of the den and you lose. But I believe there is a need to get Tera Raids down to an exact science, so I'm making this video to explain the progress that's been made in the past year or so that's pretty much won't change for the rest of Gen 9. So you're probably wondering, why make this video now? Well, we will not be getting any more Pokemon added to Scarlet and Violet. Theoretically, there's always a third DLC, could be a possibility, but probably not. There could be another mythical Pokemon added to the game, but even that one's a little shaky. And then we get legendaries or mons that were not added in Scarlet and Violet that we might see in Legends ZA, such as AZ's Floette. But other than that, with the 2 DLCs for Scarlet and Violet fully released, it's safe to say that there isn't going to be any more Pokemon added to the game. With this, we can definitely say what strategies are good and bad, and what Pokemon best fit those strategies for Tera Raids. You also get some of the best item grinding outside of the item printer whenever you do 7-star Tera Raids. Since grinding 7-star Tera Raids is still the most consistent way to get XP Candy, Mints, Tera Shards, and recently with Venusaur and Blastoise raids, the addition of Herba Mystica. The item printer is definitely really good for grinding items out too, but it doesn't have access to everything and requires BP and Pokemon drops. And lastly, some of y'all just need some help. I'm sure some of you already know all of this information that I'm going to explain, but just in case for some reason you don't, this video is meant to serve as a guide for anyone looking to understand the mechanics of Tera Raids down to an exact science and contribute to Tera Raids in a meaningful way. So let's go over the Tera Raid basics. For starters, there are 2 bars. The first bar in a Tera Raid is obvious, it's the boss health bar. You have to take the green bar and turn it to 0 in order to win by using damaging moves. This amount of health varies with each level of raid, but it is a multiple of the Pokemon's own normal health bar. The second bar is the timer, which when it hits 0 is when you lose. The timer will naturally go down as the raid progresses, and when you or an invited player get knocked out, a chunk is taken off the bar. It's important to note that if a CPU ally is taken down in the raid, the time does not chunk down in response. Another important point is that terastallizing is everything for attackers. Once you have attacked the boss Tera Pokemon 3 times, you gain the ability to terastallize. This can be stalled out by the boss Tera Pokemon, turning it back 1 turn, but usually isn't too much of an issue. Once you are terastallized, if you use a damaging move of that Tera type, or are using Stellar Tera, you will deal increased damage to the Tera Shield. More often than not, a terastallized neutral attack will deal more damage than a non-terastallized super effective attack, so it's important to conserve your Tera for the right moment to make sure you are getting good use out of it. Now, the Tera Pokemon has a few tricky things it likes to do. In higher level Tera Raids, the boss Pokemon will use some extra tools in order to help it in the fight. The Tera Pokemon can do 4 extra things. It can set up a Tera Shield, as we've previously discussed, which reduces the damage of non-Tera attacks and blocks status moves. It can take a Tera Charge from you. It can wipe positive stat boost off trainer Pokemon and temporarily negate abilities for 1 turn. And it can clean negative stat boost and statuses off of itself. Boss Tera Pokemon can also use moves outside of its 4 learned moves at specific moments, such as stat boosting or setting a weather. There's also cheering, which instead of using a move, you can opt to spend a turn using a cheer to support the group. A Go All Out cheer will boost the offenses of all the Pokemon in the raid. A Hang Tough cheer will increase the defenses in the same way. A Heal Up cheer will give the group a random amount of health and restore any statuses such as sleep and paralysis. These cheers are each useful in their own ways, but more often than not are just for assurance purposes, especially healing. It's better to not base your strategy on using them, but rather compensate for getting unlucky, like with crits. But one of the big things about preparing for Tera Raids is to be level 100. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen someone just enter the raid with a level 75 Pokemon they caught from a previous raid, and then they faint 3 times, and then the raid is just over. When someone is throwing this hard, it becomes near impossible for the other members of the raid to win. Plain and simple. It's a waste of both your and everyone else's time when a player doesn't contribute in any meaningful way, and takes away any chance of victory. And on that note, it is worth saying that if you don't move, the boss Tera Pokemon won't hit you for a while. This is pretty explanatory, but as long as you don't use a move or a cheer, then the boss Tera Pokemon will take longer to KO you. If you don't get KO'd, then you can just wait for a bit of time until the game forces you to auto-attack with the first move in your slot. You can negate this for even longer by having a move such as protecting your first slot. As mentioned before, the boss Tera Pokemon can throw out attacking moves that are not in its normal move pool, so waiting for others in the raid to beat it should really only be a last resort. You might get knocked out once or twice, but that's still better than getting knocked out 3 or 4 times right away, as it gives the other players in the raid more time. Alright, so with all the basics out of the way, let's talk about the different roles that a Pokemon can fulfill in a Tera Raid. Now, the most common role that you will see is the attacker role. An attacker uses damaging moves to terrestrialize and then defeats the boss Tera Pokemon. There has to be at least one attacker in the raid, else you'll lose because the timer will just run down before the health bar is at 0. Some examples of these Pokemon include Miraidon, Koraidon, Bellibolt, Annihilate, Iron Hands, and Ceruledge. The next kind of role that you'll often see paired up with attackers is a healer. A healer's purpose is to keep every Pokemon that is controlled by a player alive without getting knocked out themselves. A healer will not have meaningful damaging moves and will often have a way to stat drop the boss Tera Pokemon. Some examples of these Pokemon include Blissey, Clefairy, Cresselia, Lapras, Milotic, and Sinistcha. The third kind of role that a Pokemon can fulfill is a supporter. A supporter is a more general term for Pokemon that do not deal damage themselves, but instead focus on directly helping attackers. All healers are supporters, but not all supporters are healers. Some examples of these Pokemon include Oranguru, Quillfish, Grimmsnarl, Grumpig, Alcremie, and Stonejourner. And lastly, this role doesn't really contribute to the raid, but the point of a standby Pokemon is that they only do one thing. They stave off dying as long as possible because the player using it hasn't advanced far enough in the game to train Pokemon correctly, but still wants to complete a raid like Dialga or Iron Leaves, which will disappear and might not come back for a while. These can be anything really, but prefer to have the ability Sturdy and the move Protect, to just abuse not moving. So now that we've gone over the basic rules, let's go over how to select a Pokemon to fulfill them. Now, I want to get this one out of the way immediately. The term legendary does not necessarily mean that a Pokemon is good for Tera Raids. Now, some legendaries are good for Tera Raids, like Koraidon and Miraidon. Legendaries might have higher stats than most Pokemon, however, a large number of them are missing other essential tools for playing important roles in Tera Raids. Before grabbing whatever Heatran or Regieleki you have on hand, it's important to think whether that Pokemon fits the role that you need it to and can meaningfully contribute. Now, in order to get really good at role selection, you need to know your Pokemon basics. This video would be really long if I went over everything about what makes a Pokemon, but for a brief summation, you have 6 stats. Speed doesn't really matter for Tera Raids. If your HP hits 0, your Pokemon faints. Your attack stat determines how strong your physical moves are, and your defense determines how much HP you lose from being hit by a physical attack. Your special attack stat and special defense stats work the same way, but just with special moves. Every Pokemon has a base number for how much of each stat it gets. You can influence these stats further with EVs, IVs, and Natures. A Pokemon has up to 2 types. You can do more damage using a move of your type, and when you're Terra'd, you're Terra type. Try and use a type chart if you haven't memorized all the interactions yet. It's also worth noting that abilities and items exist, but more on those later. You also want to determine how to fill a role based on if you are doing a solo raid or if you are group raiding. Obviously, if you are doing a solo raid, you have to be the attacker. A big YouTuber by the name of Austin John Plays has some great videos going over single player strategies, and if you search any 7-star raid after it being out for a day or so, you'll find many videos going over what people are generally using. And it's perfectly fine to use these strategies, but there is a slight difference between solo and group-based strategies in that the solo strategies will sometimes require getting knocked out at least once, and if 4 people all get knocked out at the same time and take time off the timer, it will be substantially harder to win. Therefore, not every single player strat will work with other players, which is why we have healers and supports instead of everyone bringing the same Pokemon all the time. And lastly, use a strategy to pick the Pokemon, not the other way around. So instead of asking the question, can I make X Pokemon work in this Tera Raid, try asking the question, what Pokemon is best able to use X strategy? By figuring out the best typing, moves, and abilities to hit the boss Tera Pokemon, you can then weigh the pros and cons of different attacker Pokemon and create supports and healers that will be efficient at helping the attackers do their job. So now that we have a better idea of how to look for Pokemon, here's some strategies that those Pokemon would use. First and foremost, we've got direct healing damage moves. A move that does damage and then directly heals you is the best strategy for Tera Raids. Since the boss Tera Pokemon has a multiple of its own normal health bar, the healing that you get by damaging it will also be increased. This is a list of all the moves in the game that deal damage and then heal based on the amount of damage done. These are the ones that are actually useful. These are the ones that are only learned by one Pokemon. Narrows the field a bit. And then next you have budget version of Strategy 1. So if you have to use a Pokemon that doesn't get one of the previously mentioned moves, you can make any damage dealing move fit this need by giving your Pokemon the item Shell Bell. Shell Bell will restore your Pokemon for 1/8 of the damage dealt, so it functions as a budget version of Strat 1 and makes it probably the best item in Tera Raids. If you can't run a Shell Bell for whatever reason, or the healing you get from the Shell Bell isn't enough, you can just use both a damage dealing move and a move such as Rest, Slack Off, Synthesis, and deal damage in between the healing turns. It's worth noting though that you'll have to PP max the healing moves more often than not because of the low amount of PP on healing moves as of Gen 9, so do that. So now we can get into stat boosting. There are many moves that give you stat boosts, but the most important ones increase your damage dealt and defenses at the same time, being Calm Mind and Bulk Up, which get pretty wide distribution. There are tons of other moves that boost stats, and it would take me too long to explain all of them, but generally look for moves that boost a defense and an offense. Don't rely too heavily on stat boost to get you through a raid, as the Tera Pokemon will wipe them eventually. However, there is one kind of stat boost that can't be wiped away, and that is critical hit rate increases caused by Focus Energy or Dragon Cheer. Working the same way as stat boosting yourself, stat dropping the opposing boss Tera Pokemon helps out the entire team as it helps decrease the damage taken and increases the damage given for everyone in the raid. Again, the boss Tera Pokemon can wipe its own stat drops, so have some kind of plan for when that happens. So you might have noticed that some Pokemon moves that deal damage have secondary effects that function similarly to status moves. These kinds of moves are very good for Tera Raids because while status moves targeting the boss will fail once a Tera Shield is set up, the secondary effects of damaging moves will still go through, allowing you to stat drop and status the boss. One of the best moves that a healer can learn is a group healing move. Currently, there are a few moves that give group healing, but 2 of the 3 moves are locked to specific Pokemon and technically Smeargle, so your best bet is Life Dew most of the time, which is what a lot of them run. And last but not least are the damage reducing screens. Setting up a Light Screen, Reflect, or Aurora Veil is a stat boost to defenses that cannot be wiped but has to be reset every once in a while. Using the item Light Clay extends the effects of these moves. So now that we've talked about some strategies that are good, let's talk about some strategies that we know for 100% certain are bad. And I'm talking like, these are some things that when I see people do them in Tera Raids, it makes me fear for humanity because of how bad they are. Number 1, first and foremost, is recoil moves. Since the boss Tera Pokemon has a multiple of its normal health bar, whenever you use a recoil move such as Flare Blitz or Wave Crash, you end up taking a much greater amount of damage. There's always a better move than using a recoil move, so they should never be used in Tera Raids. Also, moves like Explosion and Steel Beam aren't necessarily recoil moves, but don't use those either. It's the same effect. And in the same vein of recoil moves, we have defense dropping moves. These moves, such as Close Combat or Headlong Rush, will cause you to take more damage over time and eventually cause you to get knocked out. There are always better options, so don't use them. Next up we have continuous moves, which moves like Outrage and Raging Fury that lock you into using them are bad. It gives the boss Tera Pokemon the chance to out-damage you, and now that you are locked into using a damage move, you can't play defensively, so you're most likely gonna faint. And similar to that is charge turn moves. Don't use moves like Giga Impact, which leave you open for taking 2 attacks when you can just use 2 attacks. And I usually don't see this one too often, but moves that would normally cause a Pokemon to faint instantly without dealing damage, such as Destiny Bond or Perish Song, just don't work in Tera Raids. So yeah, that's the exact science of beating Tera Raids for probably the rest of Scarlet and Violet. In the second part of this 2-video series, I'm going to be going over specific Pokemon move and ability combinations that make great Tera Raid attackers, supporters, and healers. So do me a favor and subscribe so you'll know whenever that video goes live. I beat 7-star Tera Raids live on my channel, so if you are looking for a group to join, why not just head on over and join a lobby there. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.